The sun was setting over the Montana plains, and Thomas Harper had been riding fence line all afternoon, checking for breaks in the wire that kept his cattle from wandering into the badlands beyond his property, and he was tired in that bone-deep way that comes from 53 years of working the land and raising livestock in a place where the weather could turn harsh without warning, and neighbors were few and far between. He was thinking about getting home to a hot meal and maybe watching some television when he saw something that made him pull his horse up short. And there, against the old weathered barn at the edge of his property, was a figure hunched over and small, and he squinted against the lowering sun, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. As he got closer, his heart began to pound because he could see it was a young woman, and she was in a terrible state, and her clothes were torn, and there was blood on her arms and legs, and she was shaking so hard he could see it from 20 feet away, and she had pulled an old burlap sack around herself trying to cover up. But it wasn't doing much good. The woman looked up at him with eyes that were wild with fear and pain, and she held up one trembling hand, and her voice came out cracked and desperate, and she said, "I'm begging you. Please hurry up. Please help me." And there was something in her voice that cut right through him like a knife through butter. Thomas had seen a lot in his years ranching, and he had pulled calves in difficult births and set broken bones on horses. And once he had even helped deliver his neighbor's baby when the doctor couldn't get there in time during a blizzard. But this was different, and his hands were shaking as he dismounted and approached her slowly like you would approach a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. She flinched when he got close, and he stopped and held up both hands to show he meant no harm. And he said in the calmest voice he could manage, "My name is Thomas Harper, and this is my land, and I'm going to help you, but I need you to trust me." And she looked at him for a long moment, and then she started to cry. And it was the kind of crying that comes from deep inside where all the fear and pain live together. He took off his jacket, even though the evening air was getting cold, and he draped it around her shoulders, and she pulled it tight, and he could see now that she was probably in her early 20s, and she had bruises on her face, and her lip was split, and there were scratches all down her arms like she had been running through brush and brambles. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. And she shook her head and couldn't seem to get the words out, and he didn't push because he figured she would tell him when she was ready, and right now what mattered was getting her warm and safe and looked after. "Can you walk?" he asked, and she nodded, and he helped her to her feet, and she swayed a little, and he steadied her, and then he helped her up onto his horse, and he led the animal slowly back toward his house, which was about a mile across the fields. The whole way back he kept talking to her in that same calm, steady voice, and he told her about the ranch and how he had inherited it from his father, and how his wife Margaret had passed away 3 years ago from cancer, and how he mostly kept to himself these days, with just his cattle and his horse for company. And he didn't know if she was really listening, but it seemed to calm her some. When they got to the house, he helped her down and led her inside, and the place was simple and clean in the way of a man who had learned to take care of himself after losing his partner. And he sat her down at the kitchen table and put a kettle on for tea, and then he went to get the first aid kit he kept in the bathroom. She was still shaking when he came back, and he pulled up a chair across from her, and he said, "I need to clean those cuts." And she nodded, and he worked, as gently as he could, and she winced sometimes, but she didn't pull away. And while he worked, she started to talk. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she had been hiking alone in the national forest about 10 miles from his ranch, and she knew it was stupid to go alone, but she had been going through a hard time and needed to clear her head, and she had broken up with her boyfriend 2 months ago and lost her job a week after that, and she just needed to get away from everything. She had been on the trail for 2 days and was heading back to her car when she ran into 2 men, and at first they seemed friendly enough, but then something changed in their eyes, and they started following her, and she tried to walk faster, but they caught up, and one of them grabbed her, and she fought as hard as she could and managed to break away and run. She had run for what felt like hours, crashing through the forest and not knowing which way was out, and her phone had no signal, and she kept expecting them to catch her any second, and finally she had seen his barn in the distance and made it there and collapsed, and that's when he had found her. Thomas listened to all of this, and his jaw was tight, and he felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice calm, and he said, "You're safe now, and I'm going to call the sheriff and get you checked out properly." And she grabbed his hand and said, "No, please not. Yet I just need a minute. I just need to catch my breath." He understood that feeling, and He had felt that way himself after Margaret died and when people wanted to help, but he just needed space to process everything, and so he said, "Okay, but we need to call eventually." And she nodded. He made her tea and found some of Margaret's old clothes that he had kept in a box in the spare room, and he hadn't been able to get rid of them yet. And Sarah went to change and clean up. And when she came back, she looked a little more like a person and a little less like someone who had been through hell. They sat at the kitchen table and drank tea, and she asked him about his life, and he told her about growing up on the ranch and how he had met Margaret at a county fair when he was 22, and she was 20, and how they had danced that night under the stars and knew right away that they were meant to be together. He told her about the years of building the ranch and working side by side with Margaret, and how she had been the strong one and the smart one, and he had just been lucky enough to be along for the ride, and how when she got sick it happened so fast, and before he knew it she was gone, and he was alone in this big empty house. Sarah listened and she said, "It must be hard," and he nodded and said, "Some days are better than others," and she said, "That's how I feel about everything right now." And he said, "I know," and they sat in comfortable silence for a while. Eventually, he convinced her to let him call the sheriff, and Sheriff Buck Morrison arrived about an hour later, and he was a good man who Thomas had known for 30 years. And Buck took Sarah's statement and called for an ambulance to take her to the hospital to get checked out properly. And he put out a description of the two men and promised they would search the area before the ambulance arrived. Sarah turned to Thomas and said, "Thank you," and there were tears in her eyes, and she said, "You didn't have to help me, and you could have just kept riding, but you stopped." And he shook his head and said, "Of course, I stopped, and that's what people do." And she said, "Not everyone," and he knew she was right. At the hospital, they kept her overnight for observation, and Thomas went home, but he couldn't sleep. And he kept thinking about her sitting there against his barn, so broken and scared. And he thought about all the times in his life when he had been scared and broken and who had been there for him, and it was always Margaret. The next morning, he drove to the hospital and brought her some clothes he had picked up at the store in town and some flowers, because Margaret had always said flowers made everything a little better. And when he walked into Sarah's room, she was sitting up in bed, and she smiled when she saw him, and it was a real smile over. The next few weeks, Sarah stayed in a motel in town while the sheriff's department investigated, and they caught one of the men trying to cross into Wyoming, and the other one turned himself in a few days later, and Thomas visited Sarah almost every day, and they would have coffee and talk. She told him about her life before and how she had been working in marketing in Seattle and how she had always felt like she was chasing something but never catching it, and how after she lost her job and her boyfriend, she realized she didn't even want what she had been chasing and she didn't know what to do next. He told her he understood that feeling, and after Margaret died, he had wondered what the point was of keeping the ranch going and working every day when there was no one to share it with, and he had almost sold the place and moved to town, but something stopped him. "What stopped you?" she asked, and he thought about it for a long time, and then he said, "I think I realized that the work itself mattered, and taking care of the land and the animals mattered, and even if Margaret wasn't there anymore, the things they had built together were still worth preserving, and maybe that was enough." Sarah nodded slowly, and she said, "I think I need to find something like that, and something that matters in a real way, and not just something that looks good or pays well." And he said, "You will, and you're young and you have time." And she laughed and said, "I'm 26 and I feel ancient." And he laughed too and said, "Wait until you're 53." One afternoon, she asked if she could come out to the ranch and see it properly, and he said of course, and he picked her up and drove her out and showed her around, and she met the horses and the cattle and walked through the fields, and she stood in the middle of it all and took a deep breath and said, "This is beautiful." They sat on the porch as the sun went down and drank lemonade, and she said, "I've been the